Can you believe it? It's 2020. This is the year that we've been preparing for. This is a very critical year. Of course, you all know that. Welcome to the United West. Welcome to Sharia Crime Stoppers in our webinar series. We call this our Winter 2020 series, and we're really, really happy that you're joining us this evening. We, of course, are continuing with our Tuesday night activities. We've added some Monday night webinars. We'll talk about all of that. And Mary Werbicky is our co-founder of Sharia Crime Stoppers. Mary, welcome and Happy New Year to you, Mary.
And Happy New Year to you and to Robert and to everybody on our webinar tonight.
So we're going to basically kick this off. We have spoken in the past about World War III being a spiritual battle between good and evil. We've talked about the fact that it's really pretty much lining up, as we've talked about, being the world versus Trump, the red-green axis versus Donald Trump. We are one team. United West, with Tom Trento as its director, has been one team, one fight for many, many years. We are now focusing on the one fight, which is the 2020 fight. Again, as we remember from the fall, we call it a fight because we certainly hope that it is a constitutional election. But as you all know, there are people who want a regime change, whether it's an election or not. So we'll continue to call it the one fight 2020. Tonight, we have the great honor of having Robert Spencer with us. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening, Dick. How are you?
Doing great. I think most people know who you are. We're going to ask you to give us some other background. Robert is the director of Jihad Watch. We're going to talk about that. Very, very important resource for you as we move into 2020. He's the author of many, many books, including the one we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Palestinian Delusion. We're going to talk a little bit about how life might be in 2021, and we'll certainly be able to take your questions. As you remember from previous webinars, you can look at the bottom of your screen at the Q&A button and type in your questions, and Mary will do a good job of monitoring them like she always does, and Robert, I'm sure, will provide really important answers to your questions. So these opportunities with our webinars gives you a real opportunity to interact with experts, and again, we've got Robert with us this evening. Robert, would you just take a moment and give people whatever background you'd like to provide, and then we'll jump into our review of Jihad Watch.
Sure. I am the, as you say, director of Jihad Watch, author of many books about Islam and jihad and related issues, including the Palestinian Delusion, the Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process, which is the new one, as well as The History of Jihad, which is my best book about the 1400 years of warfare on the part of Muslims against non-Muslims, a story that is mostly unknown around the world. And it's the only one-volume history of the entire phenomenon of jihad from beginning to now. Also a biography of Muhammad, The Truth About Muhammad, and the Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran. Many other books as well. And what else? I have, in the past, given seminars to the FBI, the CENTCOM, and various other military and intelligence agencies about this threat until they became too politically correct to want to discuss the motivating ideology behind jihad terrorism.
And we talk about having to have great amounts of courage for us to be effective in 2020. It's going to require all of us to find whatever courage we can. And I just want to make a comment. I consider Robert a very courageous person. He's come back from some serious medical issues. You actually there was a poisoning, or not an attempt, but you actually were poisoned in a foreign country. You've come back from that, and you were also part of the event in Garland, Texas, where there was an attempt, obviously, to remove you as well. So thank you for being that courageous. I would encourage all of us to think through how courageous we're going to have to be to get through this year.
Well, thank you. You know, I think that when you're talking about courage, yes, it's something that everybody is called upon to do. As you remember, Charb, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, the magazine in France that was attacked by Islamic jihadis, and Charb was killed, 14 others as well. And he said not long before that he knew that jihadis might be targeting the magazine, but he said, I would rather die standing up than live on my knees.
Mm.
And I think the same thing should be true of all of us. And that also in terms of the kind of a world we want to leave to our children and grandchildren and so on, if we allow ourselves to be enslaved or allow them to be enslaved, that's a tremendous injustice, a tremendous evil that we would be abetting in doing that to them. And so the only thing that we can do and the only thing that we must do is stand now for a free society and for the principles of justice that have made America great, and the rest of the world have enriched the rest of the world as well. Otherwise, we're going to look like the countries that have been conquered and Islamized over the centuries. There is no place except for Spain and Israel where that has been rolled back, and it has never been has never resulted in the peace, prosperity, freedom, and harmony of the countries that were thus conquered. We should take a lesson from that.
Robert, if I could jump in and ask a question, has it gotten worse over the years? You've been in this fight a very long time. I was reading some of you from your website about Robert Spencer, and in some ways I got a chuckle out of some of the, you've got comments from, I don't know, 50 or so people, and a half dozen of them from some of your enemies that you include on your website. But has it changed over the years? Has it gotten worse? Do you see any signs of it getting any better?
Yeah, I'm much more optimistic than I was, say, in 2016. If you had interviewed me then, you would have found me quite much more gloomier than I am tonight, because the whole situation has changed. In 2016, it looked like we were on the road to socialism, to the loss of the freedom of speech, to eventual Islamization, to the triumph of the left around the world and its allies in the Islamic Jihad movement. And that was suddenly turned around when Donald Trump was elected president, when the British people voted for Brexit, and so on. And nobody really saw any of this coming. And it shows that the forces of freedom are not going to lay down without a fight, and that this is by no means over. And so, yes, I'm considerably more optimistic than I was 4 years ago.
That's great. I even think from the standpoint of the bravery of the Iranians that are standing against what's going on over there, and with Boris Johnson now in place in the UK, I think you're right. I think there is some hope in all of this, but we do have probably a very prominent struggle here in the United States with this election coming up.
Yes, no doubt about it. It's not as if we're out of the woods.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is we have a shot now. We have a chance to save this nation as a free society. It's going to be very tough because the enemies are within. I write about Islamic Jihad, I speak about it, and I believe that it's a serious threat, of course. But the more important threat right now in the United States are the leftist non-Muslim enablers of the jihadis, who want to extinguish the freedom of speech and destroy America as a free society, and are in the positions of power and influence that would enable them to do that with very little pushback, unless, of course, they are thrown out of those positions of power in the near future.
Well, let me ask you, if I may. Sorry, Dick, I didn't mean to interrupt. I came across a C-SPAN video of you back in 2009 speaking to the Conservative Youth Foundation, I think is what it was.
Young America's Foundation, maybe?
That's it. And in 2009, talking about jihad and civilization jihad, and the crowd, they would show the crowd or the attendees, and it was pretty good crowd that night. And they just looked almost like they were puzzled in what you were saying, and I wondered if they really understood it. And from the standpoint of the youth today, where do you think they're at, and do you think any of them will come out and prove to be conservative in this year that we need them?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there are many young people who are fed up with what they're being indoctrinated into,
Good.
and they see through it. And there may be much more receptivity among young people nowadays. Here again, because of Trump and because of the way the winds are blowing around the world, Brexit and the movements in Hong Kong and in Iran, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, there are all sorts
Yeah.
of indications that people are waking up to what the left is trying to do and are determined to stop it in a way that was not at all clear a few years ago. So yeah, I think that compared to 2009, there are probably a lot more who understand that. At the same time, it cannot be denied that the vast majority of young people think that there's a terrible problem with Islamophobia, and that the problem of Islamic Jihad is imagined and is a propaganda point devised by racists as a tool of oppression. It's really just the inversion of reality, the opposite of what's true. In reality, of course, we know that there is obviously a real jihad threat, that the people who hit the United States on 9/11 and so many smaller attacks after that have not gone away and have continued to act. They still will, they are going to continue to act in the coming year and beyond. And the idea of Islamophobia is a propaganda point devised by Muslim Brotherhood linked groups in order to intimidate people and frighten them into thinking that there's something wrong with opposing and resisting jihad terror and Sharia oppression of women and others. This consequently, this deception, it makes people, it's very insidious because it makes them put their guard down to the real threat and become complacent regarding the jihad threat, because they're being conditioned and propagandized into thinking that any response to the jihad threat would be Islamophobia, and that therefore there's nothing they can do. One wonders how long it's going to go before people wake up to that. Are they going to continue to think that they mustn't act in any way that would offend Muslims and Islam, because to do so would be Islamophobic? Are they going to be thinking that when they themselves are attacked and subjugated? We'll see.
Yeah.
Robert, you wrote an article a couple of years ago that Mary pointed out to me, and you made a point about how the difference that Donald Trump is making. And I think at that point you were even speaking about kind of predicting what's happening now in Iran. But your point was, in an age of cowardice, which is really the other part of what you're saying, is part of it is people don't want to deal with reality, but part of it, I think, is cowardice. If you've got the kind of indoctrination we're getting from the left for our children, it's very easy not to stand up, to be a coward. And you made a comment about the power of courage, in this case, Donald Trump, in the age of cowardice. So we might come back to that as we keep inviting all of our listeners to be on the one team and to tighten their belts and be a little bit courageous. I'm working on it so that we can engender this notion of a courageous act and draw people into to take action. You wake up every day and you put in a full day's work doing work at Jihad Watch, as well as writing your book. So why don't we take a little bit of a journey through Jihad Watch on a typical day. Today's the 14th of January, and we're looking at your website. And you posted a number of things, Robert. So maybe we'll just take this first one and maybe give us some perspective on how you find these articles, why you post them, and how they fit into the bigger picture.
If I recall correctly, this one, the top one here, I can't click on it. I have to remember. I don't remember where I got it, Dick. I'm sorry, but
It's okay.
The epidemic of thefts, beheadings, and hangings of statues of Jesus and the saints, this is something that has started not just in Italy, but all over Europe. And not coincidentally, it is taking place where there are Muslim migrants, or where there are large numbers of Muslim migrants. People are saying, oh no, these are just kids who are having fun. The fact is that Europe has had unruly children from time immemorial, and atheists and people who hated Christianity for centuries. But what it has now than it's never had before is large numbers of Muslim migrants who hate Christianity and think that it is an offense against Allah to say that Jesus is the Son of God and that he was crucified, that he rose from the dead and is the Savior of the world. And only when these people have come to Europe in large numbers do we see this, that all over Western Europe, in Italy, in France, in Germany, and elsewhere, we see that crucifixes, statues of Jesus, Christmas statues, and so on are broken into pieces, are stolen, are in many cases, as the headline says, they're beheaded, hanged, and these things are obviously manifestations of Islam's endemic contempt for Christianity.
And again, this is the kind of thing you're going to find on Jihad Watch. You might not find it in the mainstream media. And oh, by the way, you will not see this discussed at the interfaith meeting that's going on in America. All right.
Yeah, that's
so
for sure.
Yeah.
Nobody in the West, Christians in the West don't want to talk about these things. They want to pretend they don't exist. And that's to our great detriment, because it's not as if they're going to stop happening as so far as we ignore them.
Do you ever get invited to speak at churches to really educate the community?
I have been invited to speak at churches. I've spoken at churches, in fact. I've spoken at churches of all sorts. A few years back, I was speaking at a Lutheran conference in Texas, and I was told by the organizer, the Lutheran bishop there, that the Catholics sent a representative to their annual conference there every year, but that year, because I was speaking, they were not going to send a representative, because, of course, the Catholic Church, under the leadership of Pope Francis, wants very much to pretend that Islam is a religion of peace. As the Pope himself said, authentic Islam and the proper reading of the Quran reject every form of violence, which is plain falsehood and fantasy. And I was disinvited from many Catholic churches after I was invited and accepted, and then the bishop found out. So now I know better than to accept invitations from Catholic churches, but I did speak at a wonderful Orthodox church in Florida a few years back, and many Protestant churches around the country. There are many Christians who are attuned to this threat, and many who unfortunately are not.
It's always interesting to me, any of the presentations and speakers I've brought into my community, the only churches that would allow me to do that are Baptist churches. So I know what you're talking about.
Well, we shouldn't forget the fact that, if I understand it right, you're not even allowed to enter the United Kingdom. Am I correct, or is that old news?
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it's used by the left to suggest that I'm some sort of criminal. And so, since you've mentioned it, I have to clarify that when I was actually sitting right here in my office, and I saw the FedEx truck coming in to the driveway, and they had a letter to me from the British Home Office, which was kind of exciting. But it said that I was being barred from entering the country because I said that Islam has doctrines of violence against unbelievers, which is kind of like saying I was banned from entering the United Kingdom for saying water is wet. It's obviously true. It's undeniable. It's readily provable. But Britain, like much of the United States, is at war with reality.
Well, maybe that'll change with Boris Johnson.
Maybe. I'm not holding my breath. Not packing my bags to go to London anytime soon.
Well, okay, here's another article about a TV anchor who quit, saying he's apologizing for lying to the audience for 13 years.
Yeah, this was in Iran.
In Iran, excuse me, Iran, yeah.
TV host, news anchor, who said that it was very hard for me to witness the killing of my countrymen, which of course she's witnessing over the last few days in Iran with the wholesale murder of demonstrators against the regime. And she said, I apologize for lying to you on TV for 13 years. She was a TV host there for 13 years. And obviously, Iran is not a free country. And so she was having to retail the Islamic Republic's propaganda, and realized, as the Islamic Republic brutalized its own people over the last few days and weeks, that that's exactly what it was, and that she was abetting evil. And so to her great credit, she quit on the air just the other day. And that's one more sign out of very many that the regime there is deeply threatened. The people have no weapons, they have no leadership, they have nothing, but there's so many of them and they are so insistent that the regime is in deep trouble. And we can all hope and pray that it will be gone very soon. That would be good for Iran and good for the rest of the world.
Okay, we've got this Muslim screaming Allahu Akbar assaulted Jewish optician in France. That's there's
story
this
out of
incident.
France.
I'm sorry?
Excuse me, I'm sorry to talk over you there. This is a story, kind of story out of France. I see if you read Jihad Watch every day, as I do, and it's amazing how often you will see this. It's astonishing how frequently this happens in France. And yet, virtually every time that it happens, with very few exceptions, French authorities then say, this person was mentally ill and has been committed to psychiatric treatment. And I think, okay, so there, at this point now, there is a whole category of mental illness that ought to be added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that psychologists and psychiatrists use, that has to do with screaming Allahu Akbar and doing acts of violence in the name of Islam. If all those people were mentally ill, then Islam ought to be examined as a mental disorder. The reality, of course, is that these people were carrying out their personal jihads. It happens, as I say, every few days in France. Somewhere in the country, you will hear about a knife-wielding Muslim screaming Allahu Akbar and trying to kill people, random people on the street, or in this case, in an office. And this is just an indication of what the fruits are of mass, unvetted Muslim migration. But of course, if you say that in the world today, then you were a racist and a bigot and to be shunned by all decent people. So that
I wonder if anybody will ever study the mental disease which gives you the ability to deny reality.
Yeah,
So
that's
another mental disease.
Also be added to the DSM, that people seem to be educated people who are clinical. What do you say? They're trained in this in some way to be psychologists and psychiatrists, and yet they're totally nuts and they're completely in denial about what they're really up against.
And they're part of the age of cowardice, I think.
No doubt about that.
Okay.
Robert, how do you find all of these articles? You have such a vast array from so many different countries, as well as all across the United States. How do you hear and know about all of these? My gosh, you must be like 7/24 on the news.
Yeah, well, I do this quite a lot. I try to cut it back, but I do it a lot every day, a few hours every day. And
it's amazing.
The sources are from all over. I've been doing this 17 years, Jihad Watch every day, 17 years, day in and day out. Over that period of time, you learn a few places that are good sources for news about jihad activity. I check MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, which has videos of Muslim preachers from around the world saying quite revealing things sometimes. There is also a very good site, the Palestinian Media Watch, which is much the same, although more narrowly focused on the Palestinian television, which is quite hair-raising frequently. There is a good general site, thereligionofpeace.com, which counts jihad attacks around the world and also gives news links to quite a few stories that you can see nowhere else but there. I get to as many of them as I can and try to fill out what I do at Jihad Watch is try to fill in the, wherever necessary, the ideology behind the actions of the jihadis in question. And so that's something that as the part of the service I try to provide. But I get a lot of them from the Religion of Peace. Also, Dick, you just scroll down a bit. There was a German story from Searchlight Germany, which is also a very good site. It is
It's a new
mostly
one.
in German, and it's got English translations. A lot of them are machine translations, though, and no criticism intended of Searchlight Germany, but they're just not entirely up to snuff. And one thing I had to do when I went to graduate school was I had to learn German. And now it's actually finally coming in handy. I'm able to read those stories and provide what I hope are better translations of them at Jihad Watch. Many of the stories coming out of Germany from Searchlight are nowhere else in English except at Jihad Watch, because they're my own translations.
Oh,
Very good. Well, that's a major contribution. This one is interesting only in the notion that, we never want to deal with sedition. We just don't seem to be able to wrap our hands around sedition. Nobody gets indicted. But here's a gentleman that pretty much lays it on the table. Doesn't matter what your current law is. Imams are teaching, Muhammad said, and if I'm a Muslim, I absolutely want Sharia. And that means I'm okay with sedition and throwing over the government that has its current law.
Yeah, this is an aspect of Islam that most Americans don't know, that Islamic groups in America lie about, and that Islamic spokesmen and non-Muslim experts on Islam usually lie about. The idea in traditional classic Islamic theology is that Islam, it takes the Muslims' loyalty over everything else. And so there is absolutely no other authority to which Muslims owe allegiance other than Islam and Islamic law. Now, this is not really something that Spencer the Islamophobe made up, or that comes from some Islamophobic source. That the fact is that you can really easily find that on Islamic apologetic sites and Islamic dawah proselytizing sites quite easily. And you will find Muslim spokesmen themselves saying that Islam is a total way of life that encompasses every part of the believer's existence and commands his allegiance above all things. This is not some secret, even though many people lie about it. But the implications of it are very large, because what you've got is the effectual placement of Islamic law over the law of the land, which means that wherever the law of the land and Islamic law conflict, then Islamic law must take precedence. Now, I remember years ago, I was speaking at CPAC, and I was the victim of an ambush interview, maybe still on YouTube, I don't know, where this guy came up to me and he said, "You're Christian, right?" And I always answer yes to that question. And he said, "So do you think that Christianity supersedes every other allegiance?" And I said, "Yes." "And Christian law supersedes every other law?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Thank you," and ran away quickly before I could catch him, which I tried. I was younger then. And he put it up on YouTube saying I was inconsistent and hypocritical because I thought that Christian law took precedence over everything else, and that Islamic law must not for Muslims. Now, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. Actually, I have no problem with Islamic law taking precedence over every other law if you're a Muslim, just as I have no problem with Christians thinking that about Christianity. The thing is, though, that the United States was founded on Christian principles. There's a lot of argument as to whether the founding fathers were Christians or deists or whatever, and I'm not meaning to open all that up tonight. But the fact is that they were operating within a Christian milieu. They were operating within a society, a culture that was based on Christian assumptions. And they constructed the United States such that it was not only possible, but it was taken for granted Christians would be able to live in the United States as Christians without having to compromise their faith. So there's no problem there. Unfortunately, when you come to Islam, there are elements of Islam that deny basic principles of American law: the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of all people before the law, many, many other things that Christianity doesn't teach, that Judaism doesn't teach, that any other religion doesn't teach, as a matter of fact. So that there are unique aspects of Islam that are uniquely incompatible with American law. This doesn't mean that every Muslim is going to be disobeying American law, but it does mean that a serious devout Muslim is going to have trouble being both a loyal, excuse me, a loyal American and a devout, faithful Muslim. And this question is obscured by these false equivalences and by the ignorance that people have about the nature of Islam, which makes them underestimate the nature and magnitude of the problem in the first place.
And so we have 3,200 outposts of Islam. We call them mosques, where the supremacy of Sharia is discussed every day, and yet we have never had even the inkling of indictments related to sedition. So we've got a big gap there. And yep. So all right, let's I'll go down to a few more, and then we'll change topics a little bit. This is interesting. Maybe this is something related to our current interaction with Iran. Mexican border police.
Oh, the Mexican border
report of
patrol,
4
yes.
Iranians with explosives.
The Mexican border police have been looking for 4 Iranians who've been attempting to cross over into the U.S. There's a later report, actually, that will be up tomorrow at Jihad Watch that identifies by name one of them who was caught. And the investigation is ongoing. But it seems pretty clear that Iran is stepping up operations in light of the recent tensions and the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the general who was in charge of the Quds Force. The thing is that what people don't realize in the oversimplified and politically motivated versions that we get from the establishment media, we're not told that these people have been preparing for this kind of thing for years. This is not something new. It's not as if the Iranians were completely happy with the United States and then Soleimani was killed and suddenly they're sending people across the border from Mexico. These guys were there already. Hezbollah, which is a wholly owned and operated subsidiary of the Islamic Republic of Iran, has been working with the drug cartels in northern Mexico for years now. I have information about that in my book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to Iran, that I wrote in 2016. And so 4 years later, we're seeing some of these people who have been there all this time trying to cross over into the United States. They were biding their time. And you might say, oh no, you Spencer, you wicked Islamophobe. They're not going to wait 4 years. They're not going to have the patience for that. But that's actually not true either. In 2008, I wrote another book called Stealth Jihad about nonviolent activities designed to spread the jihad ideology. And in there, I quoted a report from an FBI agent who had intercepted some transmissions of Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States. And he said that the Hezbollah sleeper cells were saying that they were not going to strike in America right now because they were getting what they wanted without terror attacks. And so they didn't see the need to go ahead with the terror attacks at that time. But now we're seeing, because the tensions have ratcheted up, that they are attempting to put their people in place for jihad terror activity. And that's what this border police red alert rather, is about.
Well, let me ask you before we go on from that. Of course, we've always had Hezbollah, like you said, we've had Hezbollah in Mexico for a very long time. What are your thoughts on Canada's border? I mean, it's so porous that, you know, I worry that the Canadian border is just wide open for Hezbollah and almost anybody to come across.
Yeah, there was a report a few years back at Jihad Watch of how Canada is home to now over 50 terrorist groups. That is, that they have people in Canada. And they're not there to take over Canada. They're there to come into the United States and wreak various kinds of havoc. So yes, you're quite right about the northern border, and it is a matter of great concern that is being insufficiently attended. And I hope that that changes before we pay a large price for the ease of passage over it.
Well, let's go to one more, if we could, that I think is relevant, and all of these are important, but this is a Michigan person, a Michigan imam who's in place, and he talks about the killing of Soleimani as a cowardly and heinous act. And maybe you could talk a little bit about this situation.
Well, you see, that's exactly what I was discussing a few minutes ago, that when we're talking about loyalty to the United States, and we're talking about loyalty to the global ummah, the worldwide community of Islam, the two things are not compatible. Ibrahim Kazarouni, the imam in Detroit, in Dearborn, is a Shiite, and thus his loyalty is above all to Shiite Muslims, to the Islamic Republic of Iran as a Shiite entity. And so he's enraged about the killing of Qasem Soleimani. He doesn't say, oh, I'm an American, and this was good for Americans because it removes a threat, an imminent threat to the United States, because he was plotting more attacks and he had engineered the siege of the US Embassy in Baghdad. He didn't say any of that because he does not have that kind of loyalty to the United States. Instead, he said that it was a cowardly and heinous act that Soleimani had been targeted. And you might say, well, wait a minute. The American left says that. The Democrats were just as upset. And I say, yeah, see, that proves all my points about being loyal to the United States or not being loyal to the United States.
One of the comments that we highlighted here is, what do you think the chances are that this mosque in Dearborn, Michigan is being investigated? And
there's just no chance of that. I don't talk to the FBI, haven't talked to the FBI in years. If they contacted me, I would say, I'm not going to talk to you without a lawyer present and so on. But I know for sure, 100%, that they are not investigating this mosque because they're not investigating any mosques. You know, it was back in 2013, Dick, that there was the Boston Marathon bombing, and Robert Mueller, the notorious former FBI director, was testifying about the attack before the House of Representatives. And the great congressman from Texas, Louis Gohmert, asked him, did you go to the mosque? Were you investigating the mosque? Because that mosque, the Islamic Society of Boston, where the Boston Marathon bombers went, it's full of jihadis, is full of people who are now in prison or were arrested going to the Islamic State, or were killed over fighting for the Islamic State, or joined Al-Qaeda and are in prison for trying to join Al-Qaeda, that kind of thing. And he asked them, have you investigated the Islamic Society of Boston? Have you even been there at all? And Mueller was indignant and said, yes, of course we were there. We went for outreach. That sums up our trouble right there.
That's exactly right. And you know, we can go back to 9/11. Those people were in America for a period of months. They obviously went to mosques. Nobody investigated. I just want to segue over to another part of Jihad Watch. Jihad Watch is the repository for somebody who does investigate mosques, and that would be Dave Gabaz. Dave is the author of Muslim Mafia. He has investigated personally as a professional, former military intelligence officer, 375 mosques. And so if you're curious, are there mosques being investigated not by the FBI, but by private citizen? The answer is yes, and they're being done in a very systematic and professional manner. And the results are stored as signed affidavits at Jihad Watch. Here's one that talks about mosques in Savannah, Georgia, and Statesboro, Georgia. You can read the detail. Just a couple of weeks before that, the week before that, the mosque report was prepared in Tampa, Florida, and Texas, and so on and so forth. If you look at the dates here, you'll see within a 5 or 6 week period, there's a dozen mosques that are being investigated. There was a notorious mosque in New Hampshire in the beginning of October, where some of the headlines were the outright rejection by the police chief of the report, just on the basis of name calling and the Southern Poverty Law Center, what they have to say about Dave Gabaz. So these are real professionals. We're going to invite you to look at them. And just think about this. We had the Boston Marathon. Nobody looked at the mosque. We just had Pensacola. We'll just leave it there for another program. Will anybody do an evaluation of the mosques right outside the Pensacola base where American was killed by a Saudi student who was taking flight training?
Well, you know, one interesting thing about Pensacola, is that it was just revealed that this will also be on Jihad Watch tomorrow. 21 Saudi military cadets who were training in the United States are being sent back as a result of the investigation after the Pensacola Jihad massacre. And 17 of them had jihad or anti-American material in their possession, on their computer or somewhere else. And so you got to wonder, what kind of a country brings its own enemies in, people who hate it, and doesn't even check to see if they might be? It's really an astonishing situation that I don't know has any parallel in human history, that we're talking about having to assume, because Saudi Arabia is supposed to be an ally of the United States. And so we have to assume that all the people they're sending over for this military training are friendly to the United States and grateful for the training they receive. And meanwhile, the fact is that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. We know that the Saudi mosques teach hatred of unbelievers and the necessity to wage war against them and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And we have to pretend that none of that is happening and that there's no problem, and bring these people in to be made privy to our military techniques. It's absolutely appalling and suicidal. And I hope that this Pensacola massacre will not just herald the sending back of a few of these guys, but a massive change in the procedures such that no more of them are brought over. Such that, I mean, otherwise you've got to ask the question, how many more people have to die so that this program can go on?
Well, in addition to that, as you'll look and you'll see in these reports that Dave Godwatch does, you know, he talks about things that are in the mosque that are obviously related to killing Jews and Christians, but also other behavior. For example, marriage with young children and sanctioning sex with young boys. These are the kind of things that are taught in Saudi Arabia, in the mosques. And the mosque in America, the imams are trained in Saudi Arabia. The imams get the message that everybody in the world is going to talk about on the same Friday. So we have people in these mosques in Pensacola, whether they go on base as military people or they just go out into the community. When the reports are done, Dave does spend time on things like literature approving and sanctioning sex with children, for example. And the reason I bring that up, I believe Attorney General Barr mentioned that in the investigations of the people that were involved or associated with the killer in Pensacola, there were quite a large quantity of child pornography. They made a point of it. They didn't think there was enough to arrest the person. My comment is, if child pornography is sanctioned in the mosque, and the people who leave the mosque, maybe they don't go on the airbase, but they go into the community, we have a problem, not just for Muslim children, but for non-Muslim children. And we'll just use the word outrageous, the fact that we can't go into mosque. I know people who just don't understand why anybody can't just go into a mosque and learn things. And
I didn't mention it, but I said before, 17 of the 21 had jihad or anti-American material. The other 4 had child pornography, and that's why they're being sent out. And we should note in this connection, just in case there are people who are watching who don't know this, this is directly related to the fact that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, married a 6-year-old girl who consummated the marriage, that is, raped her when she was 9, and he was 54. And this is not just a one-off incident. Because he's the prophet, because he is the excellent example of conduct, this is something that is imitated by Muslims around the world. Not every Muslim is going to be a pedophile, but there is a great deal of pedophilia among Muslim men because of the example of Muhammad.
And it does include young boys who have not reached puberty being, it's sanctioned for them, for older men to have sex with young boys. Once they're older, it's considered homosexuality and you get your head cut off. But if the young boy is not yet gone through puberty, it's sanctioned. And that's incredible.
Well, they have a very different definition of what pornography is. So the Saudis that were here, more than likely, probably didn't even think it was pornography, but that's because of the training and the background and what they've been taught in the mosques.
Yeah, you know, there have been a lot of mainstream reports about the Bachabazi boys in
Yeah.
Afghanistan
Yeah.
who dress provocatively and do the dances and so on in front of these men. And so this is the kind of context in which they see that material. And you're right, they didn't realize probably that there was anything wrong with it. In their own culture in which they were raised, there isn't anything wrong with it.
Right. Right.
Well, Robert, let's move on to talk about the book, The Palestinian Delusion, if we have time to do that, and maybe you can just kind of get us started with your comments that you'd like to make sure people grasp some of the points within the book.
Yeah, you know, The Palestinian Delusion, I wanted to provide a one-volume guide to everything that people object to about Israel and answers to all the problems and questions that people have regarding Israel and the creation of the State of Israel, the peace negotiations with the Palestinians, all of it. And give a history, as the subtitle says, the catastrophic history of the Middle East peace process. This is the only book that provides an overview of how there have been, what kind of attempts have been made to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians, why they didn't work, what was offered, what was refused, what was accepted, and why all of the peace negotiations are doomed to failure, and what we must do instead.
I know you talk about there not really being Palestinian people, for example.
Yes, that's something that most Americans don't know. It's been taken for granted. Even the Israeli government has now accepted that there are Palestinian people, but the whole thing is propaganda. It's like Islamophobia, only more deeply rooted. In 1948, the State of Israel declared its independence, and immediately Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, they declared war against Israel. And in all of that controversy, you never, in any news report or any analysis of the day, hear mention of the word Palestinian. And nobody ever calls the Muslim Arabs of that area Palestinians, not in 1948, not before that, and not after that until the 1960s. In the 1960s, Yasser Arafat and the KGB, the Soviet spy service, they invented the notion of the Palestinian people because they wanted to have another propaganda weapon they could use against Israel. And the Palestinian people was a very effective weapon on several levels for several reasons. One was that the American people at that time loved Israel. It was nothing like today when Israel is so demonized and vilified. Israel was very highly regarded and celebrated in the American media. And Americans loved the underdog. And you had the tiny Jewish state in the 1960s and the Six-Day War in 1967 defeating 22 massive Arab states. They didn't all go to war with Israel, but they were standing against 22 massive Arab states. And the Israelis won. So rather than accept that narrative, the KGB and Arafat devised the idea of the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian people would be an even smaller people that was menaced supposedly by the massive Israeli war machine. This also enabled them to keep the refugee problem alive. Everywhere there have been refugees, the refugee problem is settled within a generation. After World War II, there was tremendous dislocation in Europe. Millions of people dispossessed. Germany lost territory quite rightly, and millions of people were thrown out of their homes in what was now Poland or other countries, and they had to move to what was still Germany. Many other people, the Poles also, had tremendous refugee situations. Also, the partition in India, on the Indian subcontinent of India and Pakistan, tremendous refugee crisis in both cases, millions of people dislocated. I myself am the grandchild of refugees. My grandparents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and they came to the United States. My parents were born in the United States, and I was born in the United States. Now, if I were a Palestinian, then I would be a refugee, because the Palestinian refugee status is passed on from son to grandson, and so on. No other refugees have passed on their status to their children or grandchildren. But the Arab states wanted to keep the refugee problem alive as a weapon against Israel, to say these people were driven out of their homes, which is false, and they have a right to return, which is false. And the surrounding areas, the surrounding Muslim Arab countries, which were not any different linguistically, ethnically, culturally, or religiously from the Palestinians, they wouldn't accept them. And they could say, you're a different people, you're Palestinians and we're Jordanians. Palestinians and Jordanians are exactly the same thing, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, historically, etc. But if they said they were a separate people, then they would have a pretext not to allow them in and to keep the refugee problem alive. If they kept the refugee problem alive, they could demand to return to Israel. And not only make the demand to return to Israel, but also connect that to the Quran. Because the Quran says in chapter 2, verse 191, drive them out from where they drove you out. Now that is a divine command from Allah. It's not negotiable. It's like the 10 Commandments in the Jewish and Christian understanding. And it means that if you were thrown out of some area, you have to drive out the people who threw you out. The mythology that accompanies all the mythology I'm discussing here, the mythology of the Palestinians in 1948 is that they were driven out of Israel. In reality, the Arab Higher Committee told the Muslim Arabs of the area to leave so that they could defeat Israel and then return without these people being caught up in the war zone. As it turned out, they lost the war, so they didn't return. But the mythology is spread that they were driven out so that then the Quranic command kicks in, drive them out from where they drove you out. And it becomes a divine responsibility on the part of Muslims to drive the Israelis out of Israel. So all of it, you see, is interlocked. The divine command from the Quran, the refugee crisis, and the Palestinian identity, they all come together to create various fronts on which Israel can be attacked. And there are more as well.
Well, Robert,
Go ahead, Mary.
sorry. I was reading on, I think this is a review from your book, that you offer a realistic, viable alternative to the endless and futile peace process that shows how the Jewish state and the Palestinian Arabs can truly coexist in peace without illusions or unrealistic expectations. Is that too long of a conversation to start now, or would that be giving away your book? And if you have that realistic, viable alternative, is there any way we can get your book to President Trump?
Well, I don't know about that. I know some people who know him and some people who are in the administration, but getting to them at this point is hard enough. And then getting them to give him something is harder still. I don't think there's any way to get it to him. But in any case, if anybody knows him out there and you want to give him one, just drop me an email at director@jihadwatch.org. I'll send you a free copy. I'll send you one for him and anybody else in the administration you want. But yeah, one of the things that I'll give you one.
Okay.
One of the things that would be necessary would be to stop all the lying. And that would mean that the recognition of the Palestinian people as a distinct entity would need to be withdrawn by both Israel and the United States. It comes from Jimmy Carter in the 70s. Jimmy Carter at the Camp David discussions with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, pressured Begin to accept the existence of a distinct Palestinian people. Begin didn't want to do it, but he didn't really have any recourse, any strong leg to stand on when Carter was pressuring him and wanting to give Sadat everything he wanted. So Begin had to give in, and ever since then, the idea that Israel accepts the existence of a Palestinian people has been reinforced in numerous ways, notably by the creation of the Palestinian Authority out of the Oslo Accords, which I also discuss in this book. The Israeli government needs to withdraw all that and to acknowledge the truth of what I've been saying here tonight, that there is no Palestinian people, that it's invented, that they're the same as the people surrounding them. This would have several effects. One would be that it would enable Israel and Israel's allies, notably the United States, to put pressure on Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and the rest of them to accept these people, to allow them to become citizens. Most of the Arab countries have not. They don't even allow a Palestinian who applies to become a citizen. And because they want to keep them as refugees, they have to reverse all that and let them in. Now, then it's very possible that this problem, aside from, of course, the jihad ideology, it could be solved, or it could go a long way toward being solved. There'll always be true believers who think that they have to wage jihad against Israel. But a lot of the people there are fed up, the Palestinians, I mean. They would rather just live normal lives at this point, just as Muslims around the world, not to say that they are moderate Muslims in the sense that they have some different understanding of the Quran. They just don't pay attention to the Quran. And that's all to the good. We should be glad they exist. We cannot count on them to keep the peace forever, because unfortunately many times their children become devout, or they themselves become devout in some personal crisis, and then they become more difficult. But certainly Muslims who don't pay so much attention to the Quran, those are the kind that are better for the rest of the world. And so there's no doubt in my mind, and I think no doubt in the mind of any objective observer, that there are many Palestinian Arab Muslims today who would like to get out of Gaza, get out of Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, move to Jordan or Syria or Lebanon, and live a normal life instead of being constantly at war and trying to kill Israelis all day. Like I say, it wouldn't be over, but if that were allowed, if that were able to even happen, then the problem would considerably lessen. If the Palestinian Authority were dismantled as an entity, and the lawful ownership of Israel over what is known as the West Bank and Gaza were recognized as being given by the League of Nations in the award, the area of the award provision, the award of the area, the provision for the Jewish national home. The Ottoman Empire ceded that territory to the League of Nations. The League of Nations gave it to Britain for a Jewish national home. The Jewish national home is Israel. Consequently, there is no other country that has any claim on the so-called occupied territory. And yet nobody ever says, occupied from whom? Who's supposed to own it? And then the answer is, of course, this fictional people, the Palestinians, who never had a country and never owned it in the first place. So the whole thing is all this fiction and fantasy. If we cleared that away, we could at least start making some headway on the basis of reality.
Thank you.
Well, I think we better go to the questions, Mary. Thank you very much, Robert. That obviously the book is rich with lots and lots of detail. We wanted to highlight a little bit of it. Mary, why don't we start taking some questions?
Yeah, there's quite a few of them, actually. All right, let me kick them off. Am I correct in my observations that whether coincidentally or intentionally, the end result is the same? The communists in America are aiding the Muslim jihadists.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about that. Sure. I mean, look at the communists in America. Bernie Sanders. I don't make any apology for saying he's a communist. He says he's a socialist. He honeymooned in the Soviet Union. What's the difference? If he's not a communist, what about communism? He says, oh, no, I'm a democratic socialist. I wouldn't force anybody. The fact is that socialism is inherently forcing the people to adhere to it. If I were in Bernie's socialist America, which I hope I never live in, and I say, well, no, thank you. I don't really want to accept this. What is going to happen? I'll go to prison. It's going to be the same as in any other socialist state. You cannot have a socialist state without coercion, massive coercion from the state. Sorry. And, oh, goodness.
At the White House?
Yeah, it's a White House
Okay.
calling.
And yeah. Anyway, and you look at his allies and friends, it's all the Muslim leaders in the United States. Linda Sarsour is working for his campaign and so on.
Yeah.
There's no incompatibility. There's plenty of incompatibility between American free society and Islamic law, but there's no incompatibility between socialism and Islamic law, unless the socialists insist on establishing an atheist state, which even in the past in atheist states, they've usually had a place for Islam, because Islam, with its creation of an earthly utopia under Sharia, is readily compatible with the socialist agenda, unless they've generally gone easier on it than they have on Christianity.
Okay, we got one that says, you said you were more optimistic now, but Phil Haney and Claire Lopez have told us that the penetration of the Muslim Brotherhood in our current administration is worse than under Obama. Your comments, please.
Well, there's no doubt, yes, that it's continued, and I'm aware of what they're saying and why they're saying that, but I think that only in this administration is there any chance to roll this back. If Hillary Clinton were president, it would be 10 times worse than it is now. Now, that might be cold comfort. I grant you that. When you see that he's been president for 3 years and things have not gotten better, they've only gotten worse. But at the same time, when you have the Attorney General saying that the Pensacola jihadi was motivated by the jihadist ideology, I was amazed by that, because in 2011, the Obama administration outlawed that kind of talk and made it so that it was impossible to connect Islam and jihad with terrorism. They removed all mention of Islam and jihad from counterterror training. So if the Attorney General can say that, then we're not really very far from being able to acknowledge the possibility that there's infiltration and make moves against it. Whereas this would not even be remotely on the table were Hillary Clinton president.
Okay. Other than Muslims, is there anyone else that is profiting from the movement of Islam to all parts of the world, pushing the agenda?
Yeah, sure, the international left is, yeah. Because in the first place, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, says, obey the leader, even if he's an Ethiopian with the head of a raisin or a terrible sinner. You have to obey him. That's his words, not mine. That goes real well with socialism, because socialism wants a docile, obedient population that will allow all its rights to be violated. And so this is why you have dictatorships all over the Islamic world, because it's an ideology that lends itself to dictatorship, and there's no room for a democratic tradition in it, because you just accept Sharia and implement Sharia, and that's it. There's no voting. What are you going to vote on? It's all set out by a law. And there is an easy compatibility with socialism in payment of the alms, the zakat, and so on, taking care of the poor and taxing the people in order to do this, so that you end up with a docile population that accepts state control and will accept tyranny. And so, yeah, it's very good for the left. They love Islam. This is one of the reasons why they love Islam.
Regarding the training purge that Obama put in place to remove all the training, recently Bill Barr commented that the Pensacola attack was jihad motivated. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think I just covered that.
Okay.
It's a very good sign. Certainly we're not where we want to be, but we've got much more of a chance than we would have otherwise.
The media and the politicians say that Saudi Arabia is an ally of Israel and the United States. Is this true, or is Saudi Arabia only using us to fight their civil war against the Shiites of Iran?
The latter. Obviously, Saudi Arabia could never be an ally of an infidel state, and they will pretend to be an ally of an infidel state insofar as it's to their advantage to do so. If it ceases to be their advantage to do so, then they will no longer be our allies. And I don't know how much this is recognized in Washington. I hope that it is by somebody, but I doubt that it is on the part of the State Department establishment.
Okay, more and more Muslims are running for elective office. What is the best way to confront them and expose their beliefs? And can they run to say that they can swear to the Constitution?
Well, sure they can. Whether they're serious about it or not is another thing, especially when they're sworn in on the Quran.
Mm.
People will say, oh, no, you're just being Islamophobic again. That's just symbolic. That's just ceremonial. That has nothing to do with anything important. But I do think it's significant that the Quran allows, under certain circumstances, Muslims to deceive unbelievers. This is rooted in chapter 3, verse 28, which says, do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. The gloss on that in the classic commentaries, like Ibn Kathir quotes Abu Darda, who was one of the companions of Muhammad, and he says, we smile in the faces of some people, but behind their backs we curse them. The idea of swearing on the Bible was to be bound to tell the truth and to behave honorably. And if the Quran doesn't teach those things, then you're not going to get those things from the elected officials who swear on it. But of course, nobody dares to discuss this with any of them who have done so. I think that the record of Ilhan Omar in Congress and her numerous anti-American statements indicates that this is something that ought to be discussed, and that these questions and related questions ought to be asked to Muslim candidates who are running. But it's very difficult, because anybody who stands up in a public forum and asks a candidate those questions is going to be denounced as bigoted and Islamophobic and all the rest of this nonsense. So it's probably better to go about it in other ways and ask the candidate questions that are not couched in the framework of asking about his or her religious faith, but about his or her political philosophy in various ways that would be revealing of attitudes that are incompatible with American law. Now, there again, you have to deal with the possibility or even likelihood that the candidate is not being honest. And you can hope to have the chance to follow up, to try to clarify, to make distinctions, or try to frame your question in such a way as to acquire a revealing statement, even when the person is trying to be very guarded. But that, of course, is extremely difficult.
Okay, how can all the various Islamic groups that are antagonistic to one another, excuse me, gather together in unity under the OIC? What is the goal of the OIC?
The goal of the OIC is to implement Sharia around the world. And they can come together there because there's an old Arabic proverb that translates, my brother against my brother, but both of us together against our cousin. And that sums it all up right there. They hate each other, but they hate infidels worse, and will always unite to fight infidels. Witness also the financial support that the Islamic Republic of Iran, the foremost Shiite entity in the world, gives to the Sunnis of Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
Okay, here's one. Do Shiites adhere to the fatwas produced by Sunnis?
No, not at all.
Do they have fatwas that they follow
Yeah,
and
I
issue?
was, they fatwas are another thing, really, but a lot of the law is remarkably similar. When you're talking about Islamic law, it's not based, first off, I mean, I hope I'm not straying from your question here, but Islamic law is not based on fatwas first and foremost. A fatwa is an interpretation of Islamic law to settle a disputed question. But the Islamic law itself is all settled. Both Sunnis and Shia agree on that. And Islamic law comes from the Quran and from the, oh my goodness, sorry, and from the Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad, the words and deeds of Muhammad. Now, Sunnis and Shia have different Hadith collections, and so they do not accept each other's collections, but the content of them is essentially the same. I was having a Twitter exchange, really, with the famous moderate Imam, the Imam of Peace, Imam Tawhidi, a few months ago, that you may be interested in finding. He was saying, what was it? I'm sorry, I can't remember what the issue was, but he said that something was not Islamic. And I quoted some Sunni hadith. I intentionally quoted the Sunni hadith. It was perhaps not very nice of me, because it was, I wanted to see what he was going to say. And he said Bukhari and Muslim, who were the authors of the Sunni Hadith, were madmen, and real Muslims don't pay attention to that. And so then I quoted the Shiite Hadith saying the same things. And then he had to say, well, yes, of course, this is Shiites believe all this as well. It was about dogs. And the Americans, because we're so witless about Islam, sending dogs over to trained bomb-sniffing dogs, and sending them over to Egypt and Jordan, where they end up getting kicked and starved and abused in other ways. And these were news stories about this. And Tawhidi said something about how only the extremists hate dogs. And so I was saying, well, no, this is actually quite mainstream in Islam. And then he said, oh, well, it's just the Sunnis. And then I showed him the Shiites. And so what we have is a great deal, almost everything, as a matter of fact, agreed upon by Sunnis and Shia. It's just that they have different sources for where they get it out of.
Okay. Does the Muslim Brotherhood or its affiliates exist in the Shiite countries like Iran?
No.
I didn't think so.
But the Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni entity. It is trying to reestablish the caliphate. The caliphate is a uniquely Sunni idea. The split between the Sunnis and the Shiites is over what the leadership of the Islamic community should be. And the caliphate is the Sunni idea. In very brief, the idea was that the Shiites said after Muhammad died that Ali, one of his followers, should be, and also his son-in-law, the husband of Fatima, his daughter, Ali should be his successor, and that he had chosen Ali to be his successor. And the Sunnis said, oh, no, he didn't. And the successor of Muhammad should just be the best man from among the tribe, the Quraysh tribe that Muhammad was a member of. And so even to this day, the Sunnis say you just choose the best man from somebody descended from the Quraysh of Mecca, which is sort of silly in itself, because there are people all over the world you can find who say that they're Qurayshis, which is silly because you got all these people in Pakistan who say they're relatives of Muhammad or members of his tribe, and it's fictional, but that's another story. And the Shiites say that the Imam, in Sunni Islam, the Imam is like your local rabbi or parish priest, and in Shiite Islam, he's the leader of the whole community, the Muslims worldwide. And the Imams have to be descendants of Ali and relatives of Muhammad in members of Muhammad's household. But the imamate ended in the 9th century when the 12th Imam disappeared. He's, of course, the savior figure who's going to come back at the end of the world. The Sunnis don't buy any of that because they don't buy the Imams. They just have the caliphate, but the caliphate was abolished in 1924 by the Turkish secularists. The Islamic State, or ISIS, tried to reestablish it. They did for a few years. There's still many Muslims around the world who accept the ISIS caliphate, but of course most do not. Most would tell you there is no caliphate and has not been for over 90 years now.
All right, last question. The DOJ and FBI has a bridges program in Michigan, yet the FBI has been told by Congress that it should no longer have an outreach to CARE. How do we stop this program, knowing full well that the CARE is part of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, the problem is the FBI. And one thing we saw during the whole business about Russian collusion and Trump is how deeply corrupt and compromised the FBI is. And I don't think any American should give it the respect that we were all brought up to have for it, or assume that it's on the side of the angels in any way. And so it's not surprising that the FBI would continue to be working for CARE. And what we just need to do is do our best to expose and embarrass the FBI and CARE at all times by telling the truth about them. Sometimes public pressure can work, and I don't know of anything else that has worked. Certainly going to the FBI and saying you guys ought not to be working with CARE is not going to cutting the ice with them.
Right.
But if they're embarrassed in the public forum, if you can manage to do that, then you may be able to stop local interaction between the FBI and care branches around the country.
That's the last question, Dick. I'll let you take it from here.
Well, thank you very much. Let me go find where we're going here. We're going to go there, I think. Yes. We're going to just spend 5 more minutes. First of all, Robert, thank you so much. This was
Excellent.
absolutely superb. And we're going to remind people that this will be posted at the United West under the Sharia Crime Stoppers banner. Of course, we would very much like you to share that with other people. If you stick with us for 5 minutes, Robert, you may have some comments on some of our other guests, but also on our action items. So and we'll give you the final word in just a bit. We want people to know that there's an ongoing news program every single day, a weekday. It's at 11 o'clock to noon. It's on terrestrial radio at WWNN. It's Tom Trento, the Tom Trento Show. It's actually done here in this studio, and Tom's on the radio every day. The podcasts are posted. It's very timely information, so you can go to iHeartRadio anywhere in the world and listen to it. We invite you to do that. Remembering, of course, that Tom's label includes now the fact that he's been blacklisted by Google. You won't find Tom, if you do Google searches, you will be actively kept away from his resources by our friends or non-friends at Google. But you will get a chance to see Tom Trento Thursday night. We're going to give you a very special webinar, usually on Tuesday. A couple of Thursdays we'll throw them in. This Thursday, Tom Trento will be speaking in this studio to all the webinar audiences. If you're registered, you're going to get the links and you can watch Tom Trento. Very important topic. Tom is kicking off 2020 with the very important information that Donald Trump is in trouble in Florida. If he's under attack in Florida, big money, heavy organization by the leftists and the Sharia folks, and we're looking for help in Florida. If Donald Trump loses Florida, he will not be the president in 2021. So please watch Thursday night. We then go back to next Monday. Next Monday will be the 20th. That means Christine Douglas Williams will do our news briefing that evening. Again, these are news briefings. Make America Think Again is part of the tagline. That means it's current information. Christine Douglas Williams, who also writes for Jihad Watch with Robert, will be our host every other week. So we have Claire Lopez. We had her last night, but that'll be posted on United West as well. Claire Lopez will be back on the 27th, but next Monday on the 20th and every other Monday after that will be Christine Douglas Williams. Very important pair that keeps us posted on news. That'll be the next day will actually be the 21st, another Tuesday, a week from today. These are the more in-depth briefings that are based on citizens briefings, and Brandon House will be telling us about his new documentary, Siege. We're actually going to watch a trailer for Siege, and then he'll be live with us to explain the background behind that. So Siege is available. It is a 6-hour documentary, and we're going to see about a 20-minute trailer of it, and then he will discuss why it's done, what it means, and give you some ideas of who is involved in the documentary Siege. Happens to be another 3-webinar week, because on the 23rd, which would be a week from this Thursday, we're going to bring back Mark Christian. Dr. Mark Christian is an ex-Muslim convert to Christianity. He runs Global Faith, correct, Mary?
That is it.
And they meet once a month. In the evening, they have a dinner meeting in Omaha, and we found a way to get our cameras into their meeting. And he does because of his background, by the way, he was an imam, right, Mary?
That's correct. And his family are in the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood back in Egypt.
And so he knows what he's talking about, and he's converted to Christianity. We were able to listen in on their meeting in Omaha on Thursday nights, so typically the 4th Thursday of each month. So on the 23rd, we will be giving you an extra one. There's one more. The next Monday will be Claire Lopez. That'll be on the 27th. On the 28th, another Tuesday, we're going to have Philip Haney. We talked a little bit tonight about the Quds Force, the IRCG, the Iranians, and we just talked a moment ago about the Muslim Brotherhood. It turns out that Philip will give you chapter and verse of recent interactions and how they are, in fact, global allies against Israel and, of course, America. So Philip, and as you've heard Philip before, his detailed, documented evidence is so important. So we wanted you to be aware of that. This is just January. We've got February planned. We'll tell you more about that. Our goal is to give you content that you can use to bring to other people and that be participated in this 2020 fight. The action items are typically things we want you to consider. Again, we'll invite Robert to comment or perhaps add some of his own action items. We want you to watch the clock. The game is underway. The clock is ticking 293 days. Every day is a priority. Recently on the radio, we had Dr. Ronnie Wessler talking about Israel, and he made the comment, in Israel, they are at war in some way every single day. They respond to each little threat, and they do that on an incremental basis. They're at war every day, and they know it, as opposed to putting their head in the sand, which is what we're doing, not recognizing the war until we have some big eruption. So another thing we invite you to do is start the conversation. Invite people to think about what life will be in 2021 if Donald Trump's not the president. How will it affect them as a mother, as a father, as a pastor, as a worker, as a business owner? A good way to start the conversation. You know, we really would like for you to multiply. We're very gratified by the growth of our registration set, but we would really love for you to take this content and share it. Find it on the website, Sharia Crime Stoppers, under the UnitedWest.org, and share the broadcast. Get people to listen to the live broadcast, but the podcasts are very, very valuable. Again, there's Sharia Crime Stoppers webinars there, and then the Tom Trento radio shows. By the way, Mary is a very busy lady. Mary manages that amazing website, the United West. So you'll find the podcast there. I think you're already way ahead of us today. I know that you're already following Robert, or after tonight, you're definitely going to follow Robert Spencer at Jihad Watch. What a great source of information.
Let me clarify that, Robert, that's jihadwatch.org, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, .org.
Thank you, Mary. Also, before we forget, Robert, if somebody's interested in the book, where do they find the book?
The book's at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and at any self-respecting bookstore.
Okay, a couple more web action items. We really focus on the evangelicals because, particularly, very simple, I'll give you a hint. On Thursday, Tom Trento is going to talk about Florida, the 29 electoral votes. And he's going to talk about evangelicals. These are really good people. They are in the crosshairs of the left. They're in the crosshairs of the Sharia folks. But 2 million of them in Florida did not vote. They're not registered and they don't vote. If they did vote, they could make the difference in Florida and in other states. So we're going to invite you to get to know an evangelical. If you are one, make sure that you're speaking to others and get them to wake up to the threat to them personally, not just religious liberty, but actual physical safety. Evangelicals are in the crosshairs for the red-green axis. And then basically, you know, think about using your time and your money strategically. Your state's important. There are other states like Florida and Texas that you're going to want to save some time and money for just because they're so important. Robert, what are your closing thoughts, including action items?
Well, I suppose the main thing is to be informed, to make sure that you are informed about the issues. Read Jihad Watch and your sites that you explained. This is extraordinarily important because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there right now that it's very easy to be confused. And the establishment media is increasingly dishonest. I've seen quite recently news stories that were just outrageously false, but who knows that they're false when they're in the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on. You got to keep your eyes open all the time and work hard at being informed, and be aware that these mainstream outlets are, for the most part, propaganda and are not honest news sources anymore.
Well, thank you so much, Robert Spencer. What a great evening you've given us. We can't thank you enough, and we look forward to working with you throughout 2020.
Likewise, thank you.
All right, wonderful. Mary, maybe you can make a comment, closing comment, and also talk about this last slide.
Well, I just feel very blessed that we have Robert with us tonight, and blessed that he is healed and able to continue his work, because it is so important for him to continue doing what he's doing. And as far as this slide, as Robert is a 501c3, so is the United West. And folks, it's because of your donations that we are able to continue our work. So please think about any donations you can, small or large, they're all greatly appreciated. And for the United West, just go out to the unitedwest.org/donate. And please help us all continue to do the work that we need to do to keep America educated, to continue to be strong constitutionally.
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Robert, again. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back, as you know, on Thursday night, and we'll see you then. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.